Hi, welcome to my channel. Today, I had to come to the realization that common sense is not so common. It is not. You have very educated people who, even though they understand words, it's like they can't apply the words in practicality, right? We start to talk about empaths, right? There's many types of empaths, all right? But the most unique empaths are the INFJs and the INTJs, right? So I had to put some information out there. I accumulated some information from AI, sent it out there onto my Facebook page just to let people know the differences between an INTJ and a INFJ. Then, if those people are gifted, such as with any of the clairs, then they would be considered a type of empath. Okay? And it just blew my mind that you have people out here who don't realize that, they've been gifted, and that they're gifted is for a mission and a purpose. That's what bothers me. Okay? And even if they didn't want to go on a mission or a purpose, they still have personal challenges that they have to overcome because they was gifted. Okay? So the feeling aspect of an empath is, one that seems to have been dominant, especially during, the age of Pisces. Because Pisces is definitely a water sign. It's about your emotions, and it's about feeling. Right? Emotions are about feeling. But now that we're going into the age of Aquarius, we're entering into an era where it's going to be more about thinking, because air is a mental element. Okay? And I understand, that, attention, power, status, those are very difficult things, to have to give up. And people grieve in different ways. I understand this. And I see so many of the water signs and people who have strong water placements, struggling to transform. And it's a natural process, definitely a natural process, right? It's not so natural when you think that everybody is supposed to feel like you feel. Because they don't. They never will. They never have. Not even during the age of Pisces. So, yeah. It's not like we're going to stop feeling just because we go into the age of Aquarius, which is an air sign. We're not going to stop feeling. It's just a shift in a power dynamics. A shift in what's emphasized amongst the people. That's almost like saying, oh, because you're an air sign, you don't have any feelings. That's not true. That's not true. Or because you're a water sign, you don't have the capacity to think. That's not true. It's not true. Okay? So let's not get facetious out here. Okay? So I'll be honest, an INFJ is a lot more emotionally manipulated innately because it's just something that they're compelled to do, right? And even though an INTJ can feel the same thing that an INFJ can feel, they don't process the information in the same way, right? An INFJ will get absorbed in the emotions, whereas an INTJ may get absorbed, and then they may not. It just depends on how, the INTJ is thinking at the time. But most of the time, an INTJ is more pragmatic and they're more logical. Now, when we're raised in a capitalist society, you have people who are gifted, very, very tempted to manipulate, other people, and sometimes they feel like, they're the most powerful in the room, and who's going to check them? Yeah. And, a lot of times, those type of people, they get sent a handler. Somebody that's going to handle God's business on them. And they will. And they will. Just like a while back ago when I said that, somebody out there, did some fucked up shit that caused a release of the Cambians. Cambians are like God's sentinels. And I was thinking, there was probably a misinterpretation when it came to the Matrix, right? That so many people was thinking, to cooperate and to be a part of the, the collective was a bad thing. That's what they were trying to make it seem like when we were watching, the Matrix, and how you had these rebels, right? Who for whatever reason, they didn't really have a cause except to say that, they wanted to be able to be neurodivergent, right? Maybe that was their cause, was to be able to express their neurodivergence aware of the matrix, right? So understandably, especially here in America, where, we like to believe that, rebelliousness is an individuality that's, creative and artistic, and even if it's not, these are people who doesn't like to, conform, to the masses, because they definitely have, identity issues, right? They feel like if they conform to the masses, then they'll lose their identity. But, our identity doesn't come from validation from the outside anyway. It should come from within, right? And if you self-identified yourself with rebellion, that's pretty negative as far as, your character, because you're purposefully, demanding attention, whether negative or positive, and you don't give no fucks. You just want the attention. Okay? Because that was one of the things that I was thinking. I was like, okay, well, if we're all living in harmony, and everybody's, happy, with their assignment and their duties and, how they're living their life, and everybody's eating and everybody's healthy and everybody's, comfortable. What is it that makes these other people decide that being comfortable is some kind of disease? At least they're diseased against what is comfortable that they see in other people. I believe technically, the disease, doesn't really start to happen until, it becomes a situation where they're isolated and they can't compare themselves to other people. Because a lot of people, they won't feel uncomfortable unless they're comparing themselves to somebody that's not like themselves, or that doesn't see things the way that they see things, or doesn't have that frequency that they have, or that vibration that, they're striving for, right? And, I kind of experienced that when you live in another country, and their language is different, their music is different, their rhythm is different, their vibe is different, and this was something that I thought that as, more Americans, of different classes would start traveling, would be something that they would actually, be enlightened by. But what I found out is that a lot of them, even though they've traveled abroad, they were expecting these other countries to accept them for who they are, their lifestyle, and how, They may not even know the language. Right? Very invasive and imposing to other countries. Okay? When I was traveling, the Americans that was traveling at that time, they were the upper echelon of people. So they didn't necessarily go out, trying to impose or, be of a negative influence, because of course they felt like they were privileged, not entitled. Now there's a difference between being privileged and one that feels like they're entitled. Okay? Entitled is more or less, tyrannical, whereas privileged, it's more like being gifted. You see the difference? That's like the difference between somebody getting attention because, people see them as beautiful and magnetic, right? Whereas, somebody who's entitled, they're willing to, they're willing to get attention even if it's through negative, interactions, right? If they get attention through negative interactions, they feel like, well, they're going to dominate the negative interaction or, fight, you know what I'm saying? Cause a scene, make people take sides, stuff like that, That's more of a, an entitlement, attention grabber. Rather than, people being drawn to look at them because, they're magnetic and they may be the type of people who get attention because of nudity or outlandish hairstyles or loud clothing. I think you know where I'm going with this. If not, eventually you'll catch on. Whereas, somebody else, they might get attention because they have silky hair or, smooth, radiant skin, tailored clothes that hang just right. There's a difference. You understand now? So, it's still hot here in Texas. It's 86 degrees and it's like 7:45. I decided, I just had to get out, because I've been inside most of yesterday and most of today. And so I figure if I get out a little bit, even if it is just for a ride, then, at least, I would feel good about, going through another day and not guilty about, just being in a hermit. So now, a lot of people thought that if they had isolated me, that, I was going to like suffer, right? Because extroverts, they suffer when they're by themselves. But because I'm an introvert, I'm an INTJ, okay? Because I'm an introvert, I actually thrive by myself. Right? I didn't know that about myself until, I guess I kind of knew it, but, because I'm also a Gemini, I have the tendency to want to speak to a lot of people. I want to speak to a lot of people. I just don't want to become attached to a lot of people, and I don't want a lot of people attached to me. Right? I never thought people could be attached on a one-way situation. I always thought it had to be mutual. But, I see that that's not necessarily true. So I've been spending, all this time by myself, and I've been loving it. I have been truly loving it. And when I feel like I want to get around other people, I just get out and I get around other people the same way most people get around other people, such as shopping or coming out to the parks, lakeside, and stuff like that, right? Outings. But I could tell you the amount of spiritual growth that has happened through this isolation. If you've seen some of my previous videos, I talked about how, I felt like, I've been put in a timeout for like 7 years, right? And what it had allowed me to do is to ascend to a spiritual level that makes me feel like there is another realm that's available to people in the unconscious, in the ethers, in spirit. Okay? And a lot of people don't know how to communicate when they're there, although it's possible to communicate in the ethers if you know ancient language. And ancient language is vibrational. It is. So I felt like, I wanted to come out and talk about this because, this is something that's going on, that in the spirit, that a lot of people don't know what's going on, in spirit. You know, they're supposed to just keep doing what they do, and what's going on in spirit to people who know they know. If you know, you know. All right? If you don't know, don't worry about it. You know, you can ask somebody. If you're going to ask somebody, be willing to ask several people. That way you don't just get, you know, fake news.